Last year, as you recall, during the development, the budget development process, we gave the superintendent and his staff board parameters as it relates to the budget. And of course, they need direction in terms of priorities that we may have as a board. So the purpose of this committee of the whole is for us to discuss, and at the end of this session, we plan to communicate to the superintendent our priorities as it relates to the budget and any parameters that we may have as a result of those priorities. So at this time, I would like to hear any comments or discussion relative to priorities or parameters. Where do I start with that? You're supposed to be keeping up with that.
No, they all went on at the same time.
At the same time.
We can shoot.
But then I'll take them in order then. Mr. Coleman.
It's like we had the races or something.
The
right?
races.
I'll start with a few, and then rather than belaboring it. So, I think, look, we've had very positive news on the budget over the last year that we've been involved in this. And we've gone from deficit to surplus. I think we're expanding the fund balance. We've been able to restore some furlough days, et cetera. So, I just want to be complimentary of the efforts so far and say, I think that's a great trajectory. B, I just offer a few comments from my perspective on things that I would like to see in the budget this year. One, I think most of us have talked about this. We do want to increase our expenditures on certain items, and we want to keep those as closely tied to the classroom and student achievement as possible. And I know this is one that a lot of folks have echoed, but I think attacking I know the right term is not furlough days, but the work reduction days would probably be a first order priority from my perspective to make sure that we're restoring the full year for our teachers and that, that's a positive impact to their compensation. Obviously, in line with that, as able, I think second order priorities after that would be thinking about class size, thinking about overall levels of compensation as we're able and as the budget's formulated.
Don't take them all. Don't take them all. Other board members won't.
I'll do three. How about that?
Okay.
The second thing I would push on is, look, it's going to be hard to say no to a lot of very worthwhile expenditures this year, especially given the cutbacks that we've had. I would push us to continue to, in an intelligent way, expand our fund balance. As I understand it, a rule of thumb standard would be about a 30-day operating expense fund balance. I think right now we're at about 6 days, just as we're recovering from our deficit. That would put us, I think, at around $60 million or so in rough numbers to have a fund balance of that magnitude. We're not going to get there this year, obviously, but I'd push us to be judicious as we're making decisions so that we can continue the upward trajectory on the fund balance. And if we were increasing it every year on the order of $10 to $15 million, that would get us to our 60 days or our 30 days of fund balance within 4 years or so. So that's just something I'd push. And then the final thing I'll comment on is, as we're thinking about all the worthwhile areas in which to increase our expenditures or in which to make allocations, I just continue to encourage the superintendent and the staff to think about places in which we can reduce what's not needed. So obviously we don't want draconian cuts, we don't want to do things that aren't intelligent, but in order to fund some of these great initiatives that I know we'll have moving forward, let's also think about continuing to reduce costs where we're able and coming with a basket of cost reductions that makes sense in light of where the system is now would certainly help as we're trying to increase allocations elsewhere.
Mr. Orson?
You took on my list, John. No. Obviously, I think you probably won't find a person here who doesn't agree that trying to eliminate the workforce reduction days is priority one, and obviously I think we're moving in that direction. Hopefully we'll see a culmination of that. And I think secondly, coming after that is trying to find ways to enhance pay and benefits, and I would include the retirement benefits in here. This is obviously, there's a legal issue around that in terms of what we've done to date. But I think it's also a human issue. I mean, I've had teachers come up to me who are closer to retirement age who are worried about, what are their retirement plans in the absence of what they thought was going to be a component. And so we've got to get through the legal process, but I think trying to find an answer to attempting to restore some of those benefits. And we know that that's also always going to be a balancing process with class size. I mean, trying to do everything is probably impossible immediately, but over time. And I would encourage in that class size discussion, I think fundamental to that, and I've said this at other times, is we need to have, and I think it's outside even of the budget conversation, an honest conversation about class sizes and about being more nuanced in the decisions we make over class sizes. And that's a much harder, longer decision about where do we really need to target. Not that we want to cram everybody else into large classes, but school systems, it's a tough conversation to have. I know that Dr. Avoso and Fulton has started to have that conversation, and there's ingrained notions. But I think, again, outside of the budget process, at some point we really probably need to have a more comprehensive conversation about it. Three other things, two on the expenditure side. And I shared with you, Mr. Thurman and Pat Copeland, and I think Dr. Thompson, how about the IB program. We have 3 schools with IB in which we are not fully funding them, and we're not actually compliant with the International Baccalaureate rules because we don't have full-time coordinators. And there's a second component of this, which really just came to my realization the other day, which is because we don't extend the middle years program to 9th and 10th grade, all our middle school students, many of whom have also gone through elementary, kind of just drop out of the IB sequence, and it curtails our choice program. So kids who have come into choice in our middle schools for IB don't have a pathway to continue into the IB high schools because we're not offering it. And I think to the extent when we talk about equity and fairness and making sure that there's access, that's just been an unintended consequence of not extending IB, and there are some costs to it. The middle years program, technically it goes into the 9th and 10th grade if we pay for it. Next thing was about nurses. I mean, these are very specific things, but we don't have nurses at middle and high school, and we're one of the few districts not to have. And I will say as a parent, when my 6th grader needed eye drops every 2 hours, and I was driving over there because I didn't trust my 6th grader to actually get him the eye drops into his eye, and nobody on staff is authorized to do that because we don't have a nurse, it really struck me that I had the luxury of doing that, but many parents who are in jobs who don't have that, beyond the safety issue, the access and fairness issue, and I think it's really something. I know it's an expense and it's not directly in the classroom, but I think as responsible leaders of a school system, we're one of the few systems, I think, without nurses in our middle and high schools, and both from a safety issue and, again, a fairness and access issue, and I'd like to encourage us to look at that as a budget item. Last item, on the other side of the ledger, and I think many of us have talked about the opportunities to monetize and actually increase revenue to the system, because I think we often talk about, and I think I've shared with you all about, we have this wonderful Margaret Harris Center, our comprehensive school, which serves students with severe physical disabilities. It's a wonderful school if you haven't had a chance to visit it. I mean, there are children there who are there, people are doing, really the work that so many people wouldn't do. But we're very good at it, and we have capacity in that school. Because I think we have about 60-something or 70 students, and we have capacity for more, and I'd like to encourage, and this is just an example, we, and I think only Gwinnett, are the only school systems that actually directly attempt to educate that population. Most others write a check to some private provider, and I think it would be worth for us to have talks, and again, this is just one example of a program with other districts, to see if we could serve as their vendor, APS or Fulton, because we have great staff, caring staff that's great at what they're doing. It would save money for those districts, I'm sure, but it would also help us financially. So I use that as an example across the board. I think I would encourage us having an initiative to look where there are opportunities, like we even talked about the summer program for food, extending that to other programs, that when we're trying to create a budget, I think historically we've looked, government units tend to look at the expense side, but I think there are opportunities for us to look at the revenue side as well.
Mr. Mayfield, Dr. Marley, and Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess broadly speaking, what I'd like to see is that we align the discussion of the budget with the pending, well, with the current strategic plan, I guess would be the starting point, so that we can begin to get traction on the plan, and so that dollars are allocated in a way that sort of helps to start that process. So within that big envelope, I guess the three things that I would like to see is on the student achievement piece as an example, that, well, let me back up a second. In terms of the process, of the budgeting process, that we have a clear understanding of what sort of the base is for each organization, for each department. And then secondly, what are the programmatic areas that are laid on top of that, so we can begin to see where we have some variability in terms of being able to allocate resources, recognizing that we probably can't touch the base right now in terms of structural changes. And so one of the things I'd like to see us do is to be able to assess the efficacy, if you will, for an overused term for me, of those programs and their ability to get to the target goal areas that we've established. And I think that there are some infrastructure issues that I think we need to address in the budgeting process as well. And so I'd like to see resources made available to evaluate our processes and the tools or the infrastructure that's facilitating those processes. So looking at the workflows and seeing if there are more effective ways that we can spend money to actually correct the infrastructural challenges that I think we have.
Dr. Marley?
I guess I could have the big dream book about all the things I'd like to see take place in the budget, but I think that we're going to have to be realistic about the things that really, really need to be done, and those things that impact student academic success and student academic achievement, and which is our overall goal. Most certainly, I would like to see that we do something to make sure that we do as much as we can to eliminate the work reduction days. When we're talking about morale, when we hit one area, it has a rippling effect on so many different areas. If we're talking about morale of educators, morale of teachers, we're looking at pay, those sorts of things like that, those work reduction days, we're just going to have to be able to find some way to get those days eliminated. I'd like to see that happen. But also in vein with the superintendent's bridge initiative, and one of the areas in looking at parent engagement, you know, there have been two major conferences that have been held, and those conferences, you know, one was just last week at MLK High School, and the other one was back in November at Georgia Piedmont College, is that we're constantly having to go out and they're looking for funds to make these things happen. This shouldn't be like that. If you're going to say that we're going to engage parents and we want them to be involved, then again, we've got to begin to put the money for these conferences and these workshops to come off the way that they're supposed to, that they're done in a manner that of excellence, not being one of perfect, but being in excellence. And you can't do something in excellence if you have to be groveling for money from different places and resources. It needs to be a line item budget where there can be money to make sure that we can do the things that we're doing. The superintendent has come up with all these great programs, and we have seen the impact of what they're doing in such a short period. But we've got to begin to put the money there. It's one thing to cut, but if you take something away, like a baby with a bottle, you've got to replace it with a cup. Something needs to be done to make sure that we're not constantly cutting and trimming, and we're not doing things to enhance what needs to be done. One of the third items I'd like to be able to see, we've got to pay some attention to counselors, the role of counselors in the school system. Counselors are usually one of the first to be cut if there is a budget cut. I think too many counselors are not doing what they're actually trained to do. And if we had counselors in schools and we could actually put them where they need to be, they can address some of these emotional problems that these children are having. If we want to say that we want children to be academically successful and to be able to achieve academically, you've got to deal with the total child, and part of that is looking at those emotional, social-emotional needs. So if Johnny is coming to school and he's just had a shooting at his house the night before, he might not even get there. But I think too often we don't have the counselors in place, nor can we seem to be able to afford to pay them or maintain them so that they're not paper pushers, but they're actually doing what they are trained to do. So I'd like to begin to look at the role of the counselor in the schools. They were meant to be in those positions to prepare our children, not just for later, but to get them through the day so that they can be followed through for the next year until they get out of school, and so they can be healthy and whole. When we go back and look at the the incident at McNair and the young man with the gun. Let's go back to what happened before then. Maybe if he had someone who he could talk to, someone he could talk with, someone who had the time to be able to do what they're supposed to be there to do, he might have gone in another direction. And we look at the crime rate out here, and we talk about dropping out. The school district is not the only one responsible for dropouts, but it goes back to the parent engagement. What are we doing to put the money to engage them, but then what are we doing so that counselors also can be able to reach out and do the things that they're doing? So those are some of my priorities I'd like to be able to see while we balance the budget, keep a balanced budget. We have one, but the same thing in the same vein is let's begin to look at those factors. As an educator, I've been there, and I agree with Mr. Orson. You're talking about nurses. Something happens in the school, but also I've seen the counselor, I've been an administrator, I've been in all those different areas. We need to begin to look at what works. I think too often what has happened with education is we continue to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We develop things and we don't leave them in place long enough. We come up with ideas, and who do they hurt? They hurt the children, they hurt the parents, the community, families, and they hurt our society. We've got to begin to come up with programs, allow them an opportunity to work, to invest in them, and then to begin to see the long-term effect. Education is a process, is not an event. And it is something that takes place over time. When we look at developmental stages, if you know anything about children in development, people in development, life development, look at developmental stages. There are developmental stages that take place. Education is the same way. And I think that we've got to begin to look at those developmental stages. But we've got to begin to look at the importance of our teachers, the importance of our counselors, and begin to let them see that we appreciate them. And if we don't have good people in those positions, our children are not going to prosper either. And one last thing is remembering that for every baseball player, basketball player, football player, hockey player, every ball you can think of, there was a teacher involved. There was a mentor involved in that child's life, no matter how far they go. And I'd like to be able to see us to look at that when we're doing the budget. We talk about affecting children in education and success. You can't forget the people who are part of that line that actually accentuates and runs into what takes place with those children. So I'd like those three items to be some of the things that we talk about.
Dr. Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm just the echo in the wind and the concern for getting back to 180 days of school, eliminating those furlough days. We've got to balance our budget. We've got to keep it balanced. I join Mr. Coleman in thinking about the long term. Growing our fund balance is going to be critical. So I really want to hear some strategies and some thoughts behind how we do that in a meaningful way, one that is impactful over time, and one that we can see, just like we see the temperature go up on the thermometer, incremental enough that we can actually see improvement each year. So I'm very interested in that plan, not to the exclusion of, however, something that is just so important, and that is addressing teacher morale. It's not enough to sustain the teachers or get them back to a paycheck for getting furlough days off, but what can we do that is some kind of financial incentive or reward for the good performance, for those who stuck it out through the difficult times. I don't think we're at a place where we can do raises. I mean, I'll be thrilled if you come back and tell me we can, and I'd be more than excited to support that. But there is some measurable opportunity, I believe, between restoring a 180-day calendar and pay raises, because they've got to be sustainable. We're getting the request. They want 5% or 10% across the board, but if we can't sustain it, we would be irresponsible to request it. So I'm very mindful of that. The fund balance is important to me, and as well as Dr. Morley's concerned, counselors. I'm hearing parents and schoolhouse members also discussing counselors. How do we ensure that we have enough counselors in every building? Are we providing the appropriate remuneration to ensure that we have quality counselors, not just enough, but quality counselors across the district? That's an HR issue, but I want us to explore it if we need to consider that as a part of the budget and the dollars and cents that go along with it. And I I'm a little concerned. I didn't realize we didn't have nurses in middle school and high school. And that does trouble me, given the care that young people need when they come to school today. So I appreciate Mr. Orson for mentioning that. Furlough days, financial incentives, funding counselors at the appropriate compensation level, and having enough competent counselors in place all the time. Just a few things, and a healthy fund balance.
Thank you, Dr. Carter. Dr. Irwin?
Thanks, Dr. Johnson. My points are similar to everyone else's. Of course, we want the workforce reduction days. And like Dr. Carter said, that would help with morale, but also helps to remove a barrier from our teachers, as we want them to be as effective in the classroom as possible. We also need to look at support staff. I also have been out here talking to people in the public, and the first thing that they always talk about are counselors. So we need to look at the number of counselors we have. They talk about nurses, but they also talk about security. Security has been an issue of late, so we need to really look into that. Another point, when you go out here and you drive around neighborhoods, you start looking at these schools, is that a lot of these schools need a bucket of paint. We need to start looking at beautification of our schools, because people want to walk into a beautiful building, you know. As other board members have pointed out, we also need to increase our fund balance for our physical stability. And we also need to keep in mind, we need to reduce our legal fees continuously. So, Mr. Superintendent, those are my points.
Mr. Campbell?
The good thing about going towards the end is you can pretty much say everything that's been said. Dr. Bill, you got a strong challenge ahead of you. But I, like my fellow board members, I would say one of the top items that we have to address is workforce, the furlough days. We need to take a look at that. And Dr. Carter is absolutely right when you talk about it'll be hard to reduce 3 furlough days and give a merit. But maybe the solution would not be a 5% merit. I think a 1 or 2% merit signals that we're trying to right the ship. I mean, it's small, but I think it can be something that we can make sustainable, that we just kind of get the ball rolling and we can move forward with it. So I would really challenge the board and the staff to see if we could reduce furlough days and put some type of financial incentive in front of the teachers. One thing that I'm mindful of in business is if I get a cash payment for $500, while that's good for that weekend, it does nothing for my pay going forward. So if we can do some form of merit, that's something that you continue to build and continue to build and continue to build. I've gotten a few calls, like Dr. Irwin said, about just the schools themselves. One of the calls that I got was the track at one of the local high schools is in pretty bad shape. Not only do the students use it during PE, but parents and neighborhood residents will go out after work and walk the track. And so if we can do anything in terms of not cutting, I know sometimes when you want to do reduction in furlough days and maybe do a pay increase, you look and say, where can we cut? I'd be very, very mindful not to cut where something may end up backfiring on us. So if you want to look at school repairs, I think that's cool to do. That's fair to do at the same time too. And along those same lines, we keep talking about teachers, still skill development. If I'm going to stay in the system and I'm not being paid competitively, continue to give me those skills that I could, either stay in the DeKalb County school system and do an outstanding job, or I'm making myself still more and more marketable to go forward. So I would say skills development, personnel development along the same lines. But tough challenge, Dr. Bill.
Mr. McMahon?
Thank you, Chairman. I commend my fellow board members on their focus on the classroom. I agree. I do think creating some type of stipend for our teachers, whatever we can do, we'll do, obviously. I think class size is big. I think that has also discipline issues, manageability issues. It has academic performance issues. When it comes to discipline, I think I've heard from the public a lot regarding security. I think we should look at the possibility of maybe getting dogs back in our schools, potentially, our K-9 units. Just the perception that an animal can sniff out a gun or illegal drugs within a schoolhouse without having to lock down the entire school would be a deterrent to our student population for actually bringing those onto campus. So I would advocate for that. Regarding process, and thank you, Mr. Mayfield, for bringing up the process portion of it. Dr. Bell, I struggled in my hours that I spend looking at our monthly financials and our vendor spend. And, well, my first question is, over the summer, when we start next school year, will we be aligned with the chart of accounts for the state of Georgia, or is that still in process?
Right now, that's still in process. The consultant that was working on that has fallen behind in the schedule, so right now, it doesn't look like we're going to be on the new state chart of accounts for the 15 budget.
If there's any, I think that's a big issue, that we start fresh and clean on day one, aligned with the state. We've been out of alignment for, I won't even guess.
We've never been on the state charter. It's not mandated. It's not mandatory.
I would advocate to our board that if there's a way to fund it, to get it done by the middle of June or whenever for the beginning of this next school year, I would recommend that, just as that we start.
Yeah, I've been pushing and pushing on that. I don't think it's possible at this time, based on where we are, okay? And
it's a big task.
it's a big task. As you heard me say that when I got here, there were over 200,000 accounts in the system, and the consultant is, working on reclassifying everything. And so, and you want to start at the beginning of a budget year. You can't really do it in the middle of a budget year.
I understand. That's why I'm advocating to get this done. Let's figure it out, what it takes. Talk to the consultant, see what it takes to get caught up.
I have, as a matter of fact, he promised some information as of the end of March. I haven't seen anything yet. It's the first day of April.
All right. So back to process. When I look through the consolidated financials and vendor spend, I'd like to create a financial system where transparency and clarity is available. Right now, when I look into different departments within the financial vendor spend, I see most every department has expenses coded for Board of Education, be it under the school board, under internal affairs, under facilities, and my consideration is, why isn't that under Board of Education? If it's being coded for, it's an expense for the Board of Education, why didn't it fall under the Board of Education division versus these others? But I'd also like to be able to match up. I'd like to have our consolidated, and this is just me, one person talking, I get the consent of the rest of the board, but on our consolidateds, well, in the vendor spend, we've got probably 10 to 12 different categories, be it board, curriculum, instruction, facilities, as those departments are broken down. They're not necessarily aligned to the consolidated financials. So if I have a department within vendor spend, and I go to subtotal sum, and then look over in consolidated financials for allocated projected budget and then actually spent, it's not a direct correlation.
Sure, and the fundamental reason for that is the monthly financial report is really a report on the general operating budget. The vendor spends report is a report on what we're paying to vendors, including the SPLOS program, including items that are not contained in the general operating budget. The vendor spend report, just in the short time I've been here, has been reformatted numerous times based on requests. Right. And sometimes it gets more complicated and more detailed and that type of thing. To accommodate your requests, you might have to have a vendor spends just for the operating budget and a vendor spends for the SPLOS program. And so, I mean, we keep slicing it and dicing it, and it is very complicated right now.
I get that. I'm living in the complications, and so are you. When the board approves the annual budget by division and department, right, then I think our vendor spend should be correlated based on those budgets for each of those departments, so that when we are accumulating our expenses month after month after month, we see where they fit in each of those departments.
Okay. When you all approve the budget, like when you approve the tentative budget, you're going to have 6 budgets that you approve. You have the general operating budget, special revenue budget, which is the grants. You're going to do school nutrition. You're going to do athletics. You're going to do trust and agency. Okay, so you do see all the different categories when you vote on that tentative budget. We can entertain maybe having. I think we're getting to the point where we'd have to have separate vendor spends reports. Okay, but right now we report on something like 3,500 active vendors, and the report was originally formatted to see, hey, who's getting close to $100,000, because anything over $100,000 has got to come to the Board of Education. And then we subdivided it by department, then we subdivided it by city, county, and state, and that type of thing. So it's just, you know, it's getting very detailed, and the print is getting smaller and smaller.
Mr. Chair.
Go ahead. I'm good.
Help us understand. We've jumped down into the weeds of the vendor spend. When you look at the organizational structure, what, from the organizational perspective, is the purpose of the vendor spend? What's the primary purpose for us? How do the auditors value that? How does that compare to activity at the state level when they're wanting these reports?
The vendor spends report is not transmitted to the state of Georgia.
So it's just for our purposes, and it's...
Yes, this is an internal report that there was a lot of confusion before I got here relative to the reports that the board would get, a cash basis versus an accrual basis budget, and there was some suspicion that things weren't being adequately reported. And so there was this request that you'd have a report that would show the vendors that are getting paid approaching $100,000. And I think it was initially by largest payout. And then we went alphabetical. And then it's been, then y'all asked to see the cities and the counties and that type of thing. So it's very detailed now.
But our value, our true value is truly tracking the amount of money that's spent to ensure that we have not breached a threshold for approval.
The operating divisions ought to take care of and ensure that before a vendor gets to $100,000, that they bring something that has been awarded through the purchasing policies to the Board of Ed.
Okay.
That was, I think, the fundamental impetus for the report.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayfield.
Yeah, I just...
last question before my comment.
Oh, okay, yeah, and this is just really to unpack just a little bit, not to get down into the weeds necessarily, but to unpack the priorities that I said. I think it's going to be important that we understand what our constraints are, financial constraints are, and what our opportunities are in terms of being able to prioritize the list of things that we've talked about. I'm not comfortable right now that we have clear insight in terms of, you know, where those markers are. And so I'm wondering if it's possible to also, you know, sort of in this process of getting there, also begin to look at quarterly reports that help us understand the relationship between the dollars that we're spending and the performance that we're expecting. In other words, if we've got dollars that are targeting academic improvement, that we have some measure on a quarterly basis rather than at the end of the year or even half a year, so that we know when we have an opportunity or may need to do some course correction mid-year, as an example, in advance of mid-year, as well as being able to identify where dollars are targeted to gain efficiencies in the system, whether it's reducing cost or whatever it may be to gain efficiencies. And so that we can have a real sense of when we're making sort of these macro decisions, that we're really understanding when we're moving these dollars, that we know what we're expecting as a result of those dollars.
Yes, sir. I understand that question, and since I've been here, one of the things we've instituted is a quarterly expenditure report, which finance and the senior staff and the superintendent reviews with the division heads, okay? This is one of the documents I was using earlier today where I indicated that as of the end of March, we had like a projected target of 70.16% using accruals to give us a feel for where we are relative to expending against the whole budget. Now, and so I could tell you that, you know, Tucker High, as of the end of March, in terms of expensed and accrued and committed, was at 73.47%. Now, you're asking a question that then relates to, well, based on that expenditure at Tucker High, how are their students scoring? To get to that, you got to take a look at these financial measurements and go to the budget unit managers and up into curriculum instruction and assess the student scores. So, I mean, that's a laudable attempt, but it's, you know, I think it's pretty, right now, based on us just starting this year to control the budget, and it seems to be working, you know, maybe that's the next step.
Yeah, well, just whatever steps we can do, because I think ultimately, until we get to that place, well.
I understand. I know the point, yeah.
Dr. Marley?
I just want to say one thing, and I hear what you're saying, Mr. Mayfield, but if we're going to begin to look at, if dollars could measure success, then I think that we'd all be looking for all the money that we can to be successful. When you're looking at students, and you're looking at achievement and looking at success, it's going to be very difficult to be able to say, well, it's the dollars that's driving this program and the end result making the student successful. There are too many other variables. As researchers, you have to know that. What about parents? The same way as I'm saying, we want to say parent engagement. You have to recognize that parents are the base and the foundation of everything that takes place with children. One of the downfalls and pitfalls, and I know for a fact because I've been there as an educator, is the fact that we want to cure the head and leave the body out there in the waiting room. But we don't want to put the money there. So it has to be a global perspective of the fact that you've got to begin to look at, are we putting money into parents? Are we putting money into teachers? It's a total process. It's going to be very difficult to be able to say, and then I just get concerned that we keep putting stuff on the staff, find me this, find me that, give me this, give me that. At some point, to come up with measures that are realistic, because Johnny's achievement or Mary's achievement on those tests has a lot to do, did he get enough sleep? I was just reading an email when I went to Tucker. There was a young man in the classroom with his head down on the desk. Dr. Irwin and I saw him. And I said, okay, we're going to get him up. What's going on? He said, I'm not getting enough sleep at night. So we're not dealing with all those issues. It's going to be hard to say, does the dollar measure the success of the child? There are too many other variables. Then we'd have to begin to do some short-term studies and some longitudinal studies to do that. But I just get concerned that we get bogged down in asking the administration, the superintendent, to give us this data. We need data, but the bottom line is, some of it you won't see until way down the road. I was just talking with an attorney that was here and saying, you know, I would love to know what happened to Susie that was in my third grade classroom. And even though we can measure success a certain way, but achievement, a child can achieve on a test for today, but what are they doing with their life for tomorrow? And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. So I get concerned. I would not like to see us constantly asking the superintendent and this administration to keep getting this, getting that. What's the purpose of that? If they can spend that time and money, then we can spend time and money. As Dr. Bell said, we have to look at curriculum. We have to look at all those areas. And so I think we have to be realistic about the formidable type things that are actually contributing to student academic success. And it's not just the DeKalb County School District.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the legislative portion, I would like to make one comment. I would like to thank the board, the committee of the whole. What I gleaned today, and I know we gave the superintendent a lot of food for thought in terms of parameters and priorities. I'm sure you won't sleep very well tonight because you have a lot to digest. However, I would like to try to put them in 2 or 3 categories. One category is to eliminate furlough days and direct funds to go to our staff and show them that we appreciate what they're doing and teaching our students. Another category was that I heard today was building the reserve or the fund balance such that we would sustain the system and certainly direct funds to the classroom for student achievement. That's what I heard today. And That's my input in terms of my I had only the opportunity to summarize what other board members suggested. So at least that's my input to this process from that standpoint.